want to thank everybody for being here. Obviously, this has been a busy month. It's a busy day. We got 3 different events going on right now, so the fact you're here means a lot to me. I'm Mr. Gordon. As you know, I do the yearbook as well as the newspaper, newsletter, so it's really cool to see everybody here. If you get a chance, next door in the gallery, we have some great things going on for African American History Month, as well as what's going on at Blake. But obviously, we're here for the man of the hour, my good friend, Mr. Fred Hearns, Curator of Black History at the Tampa Bay History Center. He's got a lot of knowledge. As we were told earlier, please wait till he's done, and we have some time for some questions. So any questions you have, we'll be ready for you. But Mr. Hearns, the stage is yours.
Thanks a million.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate you being here.
Well, thank you, Mr. Gordon, and good morning, everyone. Good morning. I'm so happy to be here during Black History Month. I'm happy to be here at any time that I'm invited, but especially in the month of February. Again, my name is Fred Hearns. I'm the Black History Curator at the Tampa Bay History Center, and we're down at 801 Water Street in Channelside. We're right next to Amalie Arena, so I'm sure most of you probably been to an event there, or you know where Amalie Arena is, where the Tampa Bay Lightning play, and they have concerts and a lot of major events there. And we're right next to the Amalie Arena on the Tampa Riverwalk. And this is our 15th year at that location. Prior to that, the History Center was actually a part of Tampa Convention Center. And so we just kind of moved a couple of blocks away. And my job is to promote Black history year-round. Much of it is local Black history. And so, again, that's why I'm so happy to be here at Howard W. Blake High School and to share some of the history of this school. You probably know some of this information. Some of it may be new to you, but it's an amazing history and something that I'll be talking about for about the next 30 minutes. And then we want you to meet some of the alumni of the original Howard W. Blake High School. And I'm going to ask them to stand at this point, and you'll probably hear from them a little later. A nice hand for alumni of the original Blake High School. And they're all my friends, and we love each other. What I wanted to say is I'm wearing black and gold today. And so this is kind of special for me because I'm a Middleton Tiger, I confess. But this jacket actually belonged to my father. And he graduated from Don Thompson High School. You know, this building is named for Don Thompson. Don Thompson was a Caucasian individual who at one time was head of the Industrial Arts program for the Hillsborough County School District. And this school was named for Mr. Thompson back in the 1950s. 1956, classes began here. But before there were classes here at Howard W. Blake High School, at the original building, which I'll talk about in just a moment, there was Don Thompson High School. And that school was created right after World War II, and it lasted until 1956 when Howard W. Blake High School opened. So we have some slides that we're going to show. I'm going to talk again about the history of the school. We have some images. Most of these you probably have seen. Some of them may be new to you. So we're going to advance, if we could, to the next slide. This is a picture of a young Mr. Howard W. Blake. For 20 years, Mr. Blake was principal at Booker T. Washington Junior High School. Anyone here know where Booker T. Washington Elementary School is? Raise your hand. Not too many hands. Okay. If you know where Nebraska Avenue is, and I'm sure you all do, there's an area just a little bit north of Scott Street, and that whole block includes Urban Lux Shopping Plaza, which used to be Tampa Park Shopping Plaza, some businesses there. And then you have the Robert W. Saunders Public Library at 1505 North Nebraska. Right behind that library is Booker T. Washington School. Again, today it's an elementary school. When Mr. Blake was principal there, it was a junior high school. And the man who owned this jacket, who gave me this jacket, my father, was a student there. And so he actually knew Mr. Blake. He was his principal. This is a picture of Howard W. Blake, and beneath him you see a picture of some of the original buildings at Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington School was built in 1925. Some of the original buildings are still standing. What you're seeing in the picture, those two buildings are still standing. So they're almost 100 years old. You see the two basketball goals there in the backboards, and of course there were no indoor gymnasiums for black students at the black schools until probably the 1960s when that happened. So everything was done outdoors. So all the athletic activities were done in the open, and of course if it rained or if it was real cold, they wouldn't continue. But it's amazing when you look at these two buildings. I went to class in these buildings. These buildings were there when I was a student at Booker T. Washington Junior High School in the 1960s. By then, Mr. Blake had already passed, but his legacy lives today in this school, Howard W. Blake High School. There you see Mr. Blake and some of the teachers who are standing around him. I believe they're listening to the radio. There was some special broadcast coming over. You can see how intensely they were paying attention to whatever information was being shared. Who can tell me who your football stadium here is named for? Whose name is on your stadium? Big Jim Williams. All the alumni were very familiar with Big Jim Williams, and I was too. A legendary coach here in Tampa, not just among black schools, but among schools throughout the entire region. And so when this school opened, the alumni made sure that your football stadium was named for Big Jim Williams. If you see the lady on the far right, that's Mrs. Lillian Williams. That was his wife. And Coach Williams, I know there's a photo of him, there's a portrait of him in your administration building. And next time you are near the stadium and you look up and see his name, now you know a little bit about this man who won state championships. He coached football, basketball, other sports. He was a tremendous individual. And so we're going to go to the next slide. I'll talk a little bit more about the school that Mr. Blake was principal of. This is a modern picture. This picture was taken about a week ago, facing east on Estelle Street. This is the front of the Booker T. Washington Elementary School, which when it opened in 1925, it was a senior high school and a junior high school. Very few black students in Tampa were earning a high school diploma in 1925. Very few. The very first class at this high school had 12 students in it. Of course, a lot of things have changed over the years, but if you look all the way to the far left in this picture, and you see some buildings going up, those are apartments that are being built currently in an area that many years ago was a black community known as the Scrub, S-C-R-U-B. And almost half the black people in Tampa lived in the Scrub 100 years ago. Of course, since then, people have moved to neighborhoods all over Hillsborough County. But this is just an example of the kind of growth that's taking place in the inner city. You see it right across the street here on Main Street in North Boulevard. After Mr. Blake died, you can see some of his funeral procession leaving the church. This was the Tyre Temple Methodist Church where he was buried. That's Mrs. Blake in front, being held by a woman and a man. Mrs. Margaret Blake. She later married a man named Cato Roach, and so she became Margaret Cato Roach. But at this time, she was the widow of Howard W. Blake. and that's Mr. Blake's mother right behind her, coming down the stairs, being held by two gentlemen. This is the house that the Blakes lived in at one time. This house is still standing. This is a current photo. I'm not even sure if anyone's living in it now, but this is 21st Avenue and 24th Street in the historic Belmont Heights community over in East Tampa. And the unique thing about this house is there were several principals who lived on this street, just a couple of blocks away from each other. Mr. Ben Griffin, who, when I was in junior high school at Booker T. Washington, he was my principal. Then you had Mr. Blake living in this house just a couple of blocks east of Mr. Griffin. Then next door was the home of Garland V. Stewart. That name should ring a bell. The old Blake building right around the corner from here is named G.V. Stewart Middle Magnet School. Mr. Stewart lived next to the Blakes. Then we had John W. Lockhart, who also was my principal in elementary school. It's now Lockhart Elementary School. Many years ago, it was College Hill Elementary School. Mr. Lockhart lived next door to the Stewarts, a little further down, about a block from the Stewarts. Then you had Mr. Brinson, Grant Brinson, who lived a block away. And right around the corner, Mr. Richard F. Pride, and I'll talk a little bit more about Mr. Pride later. So all of these black principals living within a 3-block area in East Tampa. Why? Because segregation laws in the 40s, 50s, and early 60s would not allow black people to live in other neighborhoods where they were mixed with white residents. That just was very rare, not just in Tampa, but in the Deep South during the days of segregation. So all of these principals, even though they were professional people making a decent salary, were able to live in nice homes, but those homes had to be in black neighborhoods. That's the world that we grew up in the 1950s and 60s, when the original Howard W. Blake High School was open. And here you see some beautiful young ladies who are members of the AKA sorority. Sitting at the piano is Mrs. Blake. So she was a musician, she was an educator, and she really believed in education, and she pushed all of her students to go as far as they could in school. And Ms. Blake was a very special woman. I remember when this school was in the construction stages, and she was here, some of the alumni took her around and showed her where this building was going to be and where the gymnasium was going to be and the cafeteria and so forth and so on. She was very interested in what was happening here at Howard W. Blake. When she got remarried to Mr. Cato Roach, she moved down to Fort Lauderdale, but she didn't stop working there. She was always a community person, working in the community and opening up new doors. Down in Fort Lauderdale, she was the founder of the Urban League of Greater Fort Lauderdale down in Broward County. This is a historic marker, this green sign, which stands in front of Booker T. Washington School, and it gives you a lot of the history that I just mentioned. Howard W. Blake is mentioned here. Let me read the portion where his name is listed. Howard W. Blake was then its principal, speaking of after 1935, and continued in that position through the 1953-1954 school year. At one time, we had one high school for blacks in Tampa, and that was Booker T. Washington. So as the population continued to grow and more young people were being born and their parents were moving here, then we had a need to expand. And I'll mention another name I'm sure you've all heard who had a lot to do with the growth of Negro education, as it was called at that time, and that was Blanche Armwood. Everybody's heard of Armwood High School, right? Out in Sefner. Many of you probably visited Armwood at one time or the other. For a while, she was the assistant principal at Booker T. Washington in the late 1920s. And the other point I want to make is these signs are all over the city. You probably walked past several of them before. They have the history of those communities, those neighborhoods, and the people who made a difference at that location. We have one right in front of this school, and I think we're going to get to that in just a moment. So this is, again, Estelle Street looking down toward the east, and you can see the new buildings going up there. This is just a little bit west of Ybor City. This is a familiar picture that a lot of folk have seen if they've studied the history of this city. This was taken in the early days of Howard W. Blake High School, which opened on Spruce Street right around the corner. So this now is G.V. Stewart Middle School. Anyone here attend Stewart? No Stewart students here? Okay. So that building right around the corner was the original Howard W. Blake when it opened in 1956. And you see here some of the students out in front of the school, and there's a ceremony there. And I can see some people in suits and shirts and ties standing at the entrance to the school. So this was a special day because it gave Tampa a second high school that black students could attend on the west side. So we have here two ladies who were working in the office at that time, Ms. Martha Kennedy on the left, Ms. Lillian Gardner on the right. And I actually knew both of these ladies who did an excellent job at their assignments. And even though they may not have been teachers in the classroom, students learned a lot from them. They set excellent examples. They were role models. And they were some of the people who dedicated their lives to educating black children. Because again, you only had black students in these schools, only black teachers, and the principals and other staff people were all black. That didn't change until 1971. So it was a different world at that time. So here you have some students at the original Blake High School. This would have been in the 1950s, who are in a class where they're learning how to make dresses. And you see the teacher there, and you see several students learning this craft that I'm sure served them well in later years when they became adults, and they were able to teach their children some of the things that they learned at Blake High School. And the alumni can talk more about that because they experienced these classes here at the original Blake. So now we're going to get into some civil rights history. In February 1960, we had the first sit-ins that were major, that gathered a lot of national publicity, where college students sat in at the F.W. Woolworth department store in North Carolina. And a few weeks after that, we had sit-ins that began here in Tampa. What is a sit-in and why is it necessary? Black people in 1960 in Tampa, Florida, and in many other cities could go into these department stores, and most of them had lunch counters. You could walk up to the lunch counter, but you couldn't sit down, you couldn't eat your sandwich or drink your soda, whatever. You had to get everything to go. So you not only couldn't take a seat, you had to walk up to a little section at the end of the counter, order your food, and you get it in a brown paper bag or a cup, and you had to leave the store. You couldn't sit down with the other customers there if you were black. That's what these students were changing. And not only that, but they were opening other doors also. Some of the students you see here at the lunch counter, I have no doubt are Howard W. Blake High School students, because students were recruited from Middleton High School, from Blake High School, and from Booker T. Washington to go downtown on Franklin Street. Who knows where Franklin Street is? Raise your hand. Okay, that used to be the major shopping area in Tampa. Before we had malls, we didn't know what a mall was. The mall was Franklin Street. That's where you went to get your new dresses and suits and hats and shoes. And you went to the 5 and dime stores or the drug stores. F.W. Woolworth, W.T. Grant, Crest, they all had lunch counters, and they were all segregated until 1960. And that's what these students are doing. And there's a historic marker downtown on Franklin that pays tribute to those students. Mr. Shafter Scott was the president of the Howard W. Blake High School Student Council at that time. And he organized a group of students from Blake to go down to F.W. Woolworth and sit in at the lunch counters. And they did so for several weeks until eventually they were desegregated, meaning black students could sit and order and eat at the lunch counter. But it didn't come easy. It took a lot of demonstrations. And these were happening all over the South. They also happened here in Tampa, and Blake High School played a major role. We're looking at one of your principals. Mr. Bexley followed him as principal at Blake High School, but this is Mr. Richard F. Pride. We have an elementary school named for Mr. Pride in New Tampa, Pride Elementary. But he was the principal here in the mid-1960s at Blake High School and did a wonderful job. I also knew him and his children. This was taken from the 1968 Blake High School yearbook. That particular yearbook belonged to Mr. Otis Anthony, a former student here, and also who attended the University of South Florida. This is one you may not have seen before. This picture was not in a yearbook, but it was in a book that was written about 20 years ago. I think it was 2004, 2005, by Barbara Shercliffe. She's now Dr. Shercliffe. And the title of her book was The Best of That World. So she wrote about the desegregation of Hillsborough County Public Schools, 1970, 1971. And during that era, and I'll just mention 2 schools, Blake High School and Middleton High School. And then I'll mention 2 more schools, Hillsborough High School and Plant High School. Hillsborough and Plant were the oldest of the historically all-white high schools in Tampa. And of course, Blake and Middleton were the same for the black schools. So there was a lot of discussion early on about white high school students transferring to Blake and white high school students transferring to Middleton from the other schools to bring about desegregation. But you see these students marching, and what they're doing is saying to the school board and to the administration, our civil rights are being violated. That's what the sign in front says. The sign behind it says, we want to finish school. Think about that. So these students are saying, we want to stay at Plant, we want to stay at Hillsborough, we want to stay at our schools so that we can finish at our schools. But the black students also wanted to stay at their schools. The students at Blake wanted to stay at Blake. The students at Middleton wanted to stay at Middleton. Well, to make a long story short, the federal court said, you have got to desegregate, and so we're going to compromise. Well, the compromise was that Blake High School and Middleton High School students were bused to several different schools in Hillsborough County so that they could bring about desegregation on those previously all-white campuses. And what happened to Blake High School? It was made a 7th grade center in 1971. And what happened to Middleton High School? It was made an 8th and 9th grade center in 1971. So it seemed that no one was happy. The black students and the black parents were not happy that Blake High School and Middleton High School were being closed. Those students at the predominantly white schools, the previously all-white schools, many of them were not happy that black students were coming onto their campus because they did not grow up together. We were strangers to each other. There were fistfights on some of these campuses for a year or so. And then eventually, things began to simmer down a little bit. Students got accustomed to going to school with each other. This is something you know nothing about, because all you've ever known were desegregated schools. But not the case with those of us who graduated from high school from the original Blake and the original Middleton. So here we are, G.V. Stewart Middle School, but this was the building that was the original Howard W. Blake High School right around the corner. Who was G.V. Stewart? Why is the school named for him? At the time that Blake High School was converted to a 7th grade center, no one knew whether or not the original high school, the high school would be rebuilt. So the school that your students in right now, there was no guarantee back in 1971 that a new Blake High School would ever be built. Of course it was in 1997, but before anyone knew that that was going to be the case, G.V. Stewart was chosen as someone worthy of having the old Blake campus named for. G.V. Stewart for 12 years had been the principal at Middleton High School on the east side of town. And after his death, a group of citizens came together and approached the school board members and the superintendent and said, "We think Mr. Stewart deserves to have that school named for him." And so it was. The old Middleton High School, the building that I went to school in, became A.J. Farrell Middle School. And Mr. Farrell had been my high school principal. There are a lot of connections here, so when I mention these names, I'm sure the alumni and others who may remember some of these folk have a lot of memories that come back because they all knew each other, they all worked together. And so the original Blake High School building is named for Mr. Garland V. Stewart. Okay, this is a historic marker paying tribute to Clara C. Fry, who lived from 1872 to 1936. It's right in front of a high school. Can anyone tell me what high school is behind this sign? Raise your hand if you think you know. Which high school is behind this sign? See the alumni over there kind of laughing. We know the answer to this question. Anybody? Anybody want to take a guess? What was that? Again? That's right in front of your school. Right out here in front in the parking lot. So you're right. You're absolutely right. So what is it doing here? Well, there used to be a hospital right here. The Negro Hospital. That's what it was called when it opened. And later on, it became known as Clara Fry Hospital. Clara Fry was a black woman who opened up her home in 1908 as a hospital for black people in Tampa when there was no real hospital for them to go to. Can you imagine that? You're sick, you need help, you need medical care, and you have to go to someone's home who may or may not have any medical training, and that's where you have to hope that you'll get the help you need. So Clara Fry opened up her home as a hospital, not very far from here on Lamar Street. And for 20 years, she struggled to keep that hospital open with very little help from government. So she got her help from private individuals, from churches, from social groups, from other folk who would donate money and donate dishes and linen and bandages and whatever else she needed. But the Clara Fry Memorial Hospital, I believe, was probably one of the more important institutions that we ever had here in Tampa that developed from the ground up. This lady started it in her home. So the hospital was here until 1967. And at that time, Clara Fry Memorial Hospital merged with Tampa General Hospital. So before that time, black people had to come to black hospitals. And that's what happened here. So we have this marker that tells the story. I'm asking each one of you, when you get an opportunity, if you're in front of the school, just walk over and look and read that marker. This is what you'll see. And I think you'll be impressed with the information, and you say, wow, this is a historic site. Not only that, but this was also the site after the hospital moved for a church. The St. James Episcopal Church was located here for a number of years. And then eventually the Hillsborough County School Board bought this property Howard W. Blake High School was built here. St. James Episcopal Church moved to another location, and they're now at Central Avenue and Columbus Drive. They merged with the House of Prayer. And so Blake High School's been here since 1997. And that answers the question. You see where the marker is, and you see where your building is? Right in front of the parking lot there, in front of the school. Okay, this is Yellowjacket Field. Welcome to Howard W. Blake. So does the baseball team still play here? They do? Okay. And of course, the Little League, Belvin Heights Little League on the east side, and the Yellowjacket Little League, and Forest Heights Little League. So we had black Little League programs popping up primarily in the 1970s. Before that, you didn't have a lot of young black students playing organized baseball in leagues. But this is where the Yellowjackets' home has been for a number of years. And to the left is Stewart Middle School. You can see just a little bit of one of the buildings. I think that might be the gymnasium you can see just a little bit of, and the baseball field there. This is a life-size mural. You can see the people standing there. So these are life-size figures of a business class at the original Howard W. Blake High School. And you see the young men as well as the young ladies, and I'm impressed by how well they're dressed. That just blew me away when I saw this. But I remember that we dressed like this when we came to school. You see two instructors, one at the desk, one standing. So a lot of people like to take photos in front of this mural. It's a very popular space there. So we have two letter jackets here. I'll talk about the one in back first. You can't see all of it, but you can see a little bit of it. That's a Middleton High School jacket, actually the one that I wore in the 60s. I donated to the Tampa Bay History Center. And it's got the name Middleton on the back, and it's got band on it somewhere. The jacket in front was donated by Mr. Leroy Long, who graduated from Howard W. Blake High School. And you can't, I don't think you can see it too well, but there's a little tennis racket at the bottom of the B. Can anybody see it? That's a tennis racket because Leroy Long, one of the best tennis players Tampa ever developed, and a graduate of Blake High School. He donated his Letterman's jacket to the museum. So it's today at the Tampa Bay History Center on the 3rd floor, and above the two jackets, you see a Central Avenue street sign. And that was sort of our Black Wall Street. If you've heard that term before, people are primarily talking about Tulsa, Oklahoma, but we had our own Wall Street here in Tampa. It was called Central Avenue, where at one time we had almost 100 businesses, and most of them were owned by blacks. It is now Perry Harvey Park. So I did talk with Mr. Gordon about possibly some future field trips. I've done several field trips for Blake High School students, and we're actually working on a walking tour where you would start right here at your school, and within walking distance. The alumni can tell you there are hundreds of stories all around you. And let's go to the last slide. And these are my references where I got these images from. I took some of the photos, but the books you see listed there are like my Bibles. I keep them close to me because there's always good information there. And this has been a real treat. Thank you so much.